Thank you so much. Thank you, Elisa, for the invitation to present, and more broadly for the invitation to be part of the Rebalance project. I'm Tim Bartley. I'm, for the purposes of the project, affiliated to the Stockholm Center for Organizational Research, but I'm talking to you from St. Louis, where I'm also professor of sociology at Washington University in St. Louis. And Maria-Therese, I believe, is actually in Stockholm and will speak in a bit. So we're really happy to be with you today to talk about the sort of background of the project that we're doing as part of the Rebalance project, which is about some changes in the way that regulation is occurring that seem to finally be catching up with supply chain capitalism. That is a model of capitalism that's based largely on dispersed, decentralized networks of production that connect, for instance, an artisanal cobalt miner in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, who you see here on the screen, with suppliers and manufacturers of batteries and electronic devices that are distributed throughout the world. So what we're going to do today is, first I'll talk a bit about supply chain capitalism, or so-called the world that international trade built over the past 3 decades, the problems that that poses for the ways in which we've typically thought about regulating industries, and some recent trends in terms of re-regulation or new forms of regulation of global supply chains. Maria-Therese will then talk about human rights and environmental due diligence regulation. I'll talk a bit about carbon markets and their reconfiguration, and we'll end with some tentative conclusions and some forward-looking aspects of our agenda. We live in a world of global supply chains in which the products that we consume every day come from productive activities of extraction and manufacturing that are dispersed around the world and controlled by a whole network of different firms. And these kinds of global supply chains, also known as global value chains, global production networks, with some subtle, though sometimes important differences between those concepts, are simultaneously structures of connection and distancing. On one hand, they're structures of connection and coordination that connect people, places, and organizations, firms, in various parts of the world. But global supply chains are also structures of distancing. That is, they externalize exploitation and environmental degradation, such that often it's not felt near the point of consumption, but elsewhere around the point of production. There is, of course, through the operation of global supply chains, an external of environmental costs, from greenhouse gas emissions to deforestation to the degradation of land and water. And many of the effects of global production are felt closer to the point of production than the point of consumption. Global supply chains also take advantage of a high potential for repression of labor rights and human rights in the areas surrounding extraction and production. And this is both because of intense pressure imposed by buyers and brands for high quality, quick turnaround, and extraordinarily low prices, but also because buyers and brands have often chosen to source from countries where domestic standards are rarely enforced and repression of workers and human rights activists is often common. So this poses a range of different problems for regulation, which has historically been centered around national governments, or in the case of the EU, regional bodies. And so there's at least 4 types of problems that I want to point out. One is a simple mismatch between the scale of national governments and the scale of transnational architectures of production. But beyond that, there are, I think, some problems in the politics of regulating global supply chains. One we might think of as a beneficiary problem, where if citizens in affluent countries see themselves as beneficiaries of global supply chains, especially through low consumer prices, then it proves harder than it would be otherwise to assemble pro-regulatory coalitions, even if there are also citizens in affluent countries that are concerned about labor rights, human rights, environmental degradation. There's also a corporate power problem. So lead firms that coordinate vast global supply chains are often also among the wealthiest and most powerful companies within a particular country or regional bloc. And not surprisingly, they've often pushed back on attempts to limit their autonomy. Finally, there's a problem of extraterritorial regulation. There's a few interlinked problems of extraterritorial regulation, where attempts to regulate beyond national borders are often politically sensitive, sometimes just difficult to do effectively because of a lack of understanding and knowledge of conditions and effective strategies for reform across borders and across large geographical and sociocultural differences. And extraterritorial regulation is, of course, highly sensitive politically and often illegitimate, particularly under the rules of the World Trade Organization, the WTO, which limits the degree to which governments can set standards that would discriminate against imports from outside that jurisdiction. So given these problems, since the mid-1990s, the primary solution promoted by both governments, international organizations, and companies, and to some degree also civil society organizations, has been to bypass the state and create private forms of regulation that firms might voluntarily commit to in order to protect their reputations. So this takes a variety of forms, from voluntary commitments that particular companies like H&M, Nike, or Apple might make, which are voluntary for those firms, but end up being mandatory for their suppliers around the world. This also includes a variety of certification and labeling programs, from things like Fair Trade and the Forest Stewardship Council and the Marine Stewardship Council, to a whole array of ever-evolving, seemingly ever-expanding certification initiatives. And of course, this voluntary form of regulation also depends on a whole complex of sustainability reporting and increasingly systems for rating the ESG, or environmental, social, or governance indicators of large companies. Now, we know, of course, that these voluntary forms of regulation are quite limited in terms of the scope of companies that are covered in them, and also in terms of their performance on the ground. That is, most evidence to date has shown that the performance of voluntary systems has been, at best, disappointing and marginal, and at worst, embarrassing and counterproductive to increasing respect for rights in the global economy. More recently, we've seen, and this is the trend that we're especially interested in unpacking, a resurgence of government regulation in a variety of different places and arenas. So I want to first just sketch some of the broad contours here, and then we'll talk about some particular cases that interest us. So you can see a resurgence of government regulation of labor, environment, and human rights in global supply chains, in part in international trade agreements, multilateral and especially bilateral trade agreements that are increasingly dense with labor and environmental standards. You can also see the rise of market restrictions and market bans, targeting things like forced labor and illegal logging, for instance. As we'll talk about in a second, there are also some attempts to impose border adjustments or tariffs or taxes or fees on imported products based on the conditions of their production elsewhere in the world. And finally, as you know, and we'll talk a bit more about, there are trends toward stronger and harder regulation of transnational corporate irresponsibility, maybe most notably through the concept of mandatory corporate human rights and environmental due diligence. So this is a graph from a paper that Matt Almengual and I published, where we briefly kind of document some of the rise of government regulation in trade agreements on one hand. Labor and environmental conditions in trade agreements have become increasingly dense over time, but also some trends in enforcement in the US, where after years of stagnation, the US began to enforce bans against forced labor in imported products during the Trump administration, actually, enabled by changes in the Obama administration, and that enforcement has continued in the Biden administration, but also a rise a bit earlier in US federal government indictments for international environmental crimes. Often these involve shipping and sea, both fishing and shipping in the high seas. In the EU, of course, there's a whole range of different initiatives, including several regulations and directives that have been developed and passed in some cases just in the past year or two. Maria-Therese will talk in a minute about the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, which I think many of you already know a bit about. I'll talk about the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism and the ways in which that's intended to reconfigure the European emissions trading system. There's also new regulation on deforestation-free products that intersects in interesting ways with sustainability due diligence, and a proposed regulation on products made with forced labor, which is in some ways a direct response to the bans in the US, some of which led to products being rerouted from the US directly to Europe in a somewhat embarrassing move for the EU. This is not entirely new. If we had been giving this talk a decade ago, we'd be talking about the EU timber regulation and the onset of the EU conflict minerals regulation, as well as some similar actions involving illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing, and some intersections with renewable energy. So this is not all happening right now, but there seems to be a moment in which much more regulatory activity is happening around global supply chains and a reconfiguration of EU regulation to deal with the world of global supply chains, maybe 2 decades after many activists called for this originally. How in the world has this happened? We won't give you a comprehensive answer to that question today, but we'll give you some hints at our thoughts. So on one hand, it's clear that civil society pressure has been really crucial in pushing national governments and also pushing EU policymakers to sort of harden previously soft expectations for companies and their operations in global supply chains. So in some ways, civil society pressure has really been the driving force behind this expansion of regulation. But we suspect that there are also some changes in the way that multinational and transnational corporations have related to these kinds of regulatory agendas, where there may even be processes where some companies are becoming less resistant to binding regulation, and some may even become supportive of binding regulation within the EU because they view it as supporting the business that they've already built up, including potentially the investments that they've already made in their own supply chain tracing and responsibility initiatives and their own carbon reduction initiatives. So what we're going to do today is give you just an initial sketch of the cases that we're most excited about, and then a few hints at some of our ongoing research on corporate preferences around these regulatory domains, which we're just really beginning to get into. So at this point, Maria-Therese.
Yes, so my name is Maria-Therese Gustafsson, and I'm assistant professor in political science at Stockholm University, and I work together with Tim and John in the Rebalance project. First of all, thank you very much for inviting us to share some of our ongoing research. As Tim said, I will share some findings from ongoing research on human rights and environmental due diligence. So next slide. So last year, the European Commission presented its proposal for a new directive on corporate sustainability due diligence, and also a regulation on deforestation-free products such as soy, beef, coffee, cocoa, and timber. These new rules will require companies to exercise a duty of care for environmental and human rights impacts, not only in their own operation, but also throughout their supply chains. These new legal developments can be seen as part of a broader shift from more voluntary standards, as Tim talked about, to increasingly use of mandatory measures for regulating the sustainability performance of companies. And this also means that the role of companies in society and the relationships between companies, states, and civil society are somehow being renegotiated. And one of the sort of driving forces behind these changes has been an impressively broad coalition of diverse civil society organizations that have been pushed for the ongoing policy processes at the EU level and in EU member states. And under these new laws, companies are expected to change their perspectives away from the sort of risk that the companies are exposed to towards the requirement to assess and address the risk that company practices might cause and to the environment and to human rights. And this also means that companies become potentially could become accountable to a broader set of stakeholders, including right holders in the global south. So the next slide. In this process, in this new wave of regulations, the EU and EU member state has assumed a pioneering role particularly in adopting regulations on mandatory due diligence, and thereby contributing to hardening the international soft law. International soft laws such as the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights and the OECD guidelines on multinational enterprises have outlined the responsibilities of companies to carry out due diligence. And in the case of the UNGPs is exclusively focused on human rights. And the OECD guidelines added the environment to the initial focus on human rights. And as I mentioned before, and as you probably know also, the important component of due diligence system is the assessment of risk and the adoption of prevention and mitigation measure, and also companies need to track if they have made progress on addressing such risk. And this should be made in a transparent way, and companies need to make sure that there is some sort of possibility for relevant stakeholders and right holders to participate in these processes. And they also need to establish effective grievance mechanism and so that victims can present the sort of concerns that they have. But in many cases, compliance with these voluntary standards, as also Tim talked about more in general, they have been quite limited. And this has been one of the main arguments why it's necessary to have binding rules. So the next slide. Next slide. Yeah. So as part of our Rebalance project, in the beginning, we carried out a literature review. So I would just like to hint out some of the findings that some of the things that we found when we did that review of the literature. There has been a quite rapidly increasing literature on human rights and environmental due diligence in the recent years. There is a quite large literature in the debates on business and human rights, and these debates that colleagues in our Rebalance project, such as Chiara Macchi and Nadia Bernas, have contributed extensively to. And they have pointed out the shortcoming of existing international law and analyze also the institutional design of human due diligence laws. There's also quite a few studies that are emerging now about the contested policymaking processes and corporate lobbying, and showing how companies have in many cases contributed to water down initially quite ambitious and stringent law proposal that civil society organizations first have presented. This had been the case, for instance, in France and in Germany, and also perhaps most prominently in Switzerland, but also in the case of at the EU level, of course, there have been a sort of watering down of these regulations along the policymaking process. Yeah, so of course, these laws are so new, so it's hardly surprising that the main focus has been on the policymaking processes and the institutional design. But there could still be good to sort of point out some of the existing gaps in the literature. To date, there is quite little research on the question that we are interested in exploring in the Rebalance project, under what conditions companies support more stringent human rights and environmental due diligence regulations, and under what condition, if there is any sort of systematic differences between countries or sectors in how companies strategize around these regulations. There's also lack of research on company practices to implement human rights and environmental due diligence, how they understand their requirements and obligations, and also questions about how, to what extent, sort of existing private voluntary measures could be relevant for or used in support of the implementation of due diligence. The United Nations Guiding Principles talk about the smart mix between public and private governance tools. So that's is a topic that is increasingly discussed, how these kind of public-private interactions could look like in the context of due diligence. Okay, next slide. So, as I mentioned, due diligence comes from international soft law, so it's not entirely clear how to translate it into hard law. And the meaning of due diligence in these processes is highly contested, as demonstrated in the policymaking processes. So together with my colleagues Alma Chilling-Bacaflor and Andrea Lencho, we recently published an article that looked more closely into the policymaking processes in France and Germany, and looking at different discourses that different actor constellations, such as the private business, civil society organizations, and leftist and political parties in the parliament. And also how they were, their preferences in terms of the institutional design of these laws. And in both of these countries, broad coalitions of civil society organizations initially presented quite comprehensive and stringent law proposals that were also watered down along the policymaking processes. And we identified sort of three overarching discourses that different actors used. The sort of civil society discourse is the state-centric discourse that emphasizes the importance of hierarchically organized regulatory rules and forms of control, and promotes quite stringent law proposals with including legal liability and bureaucratic control. It's very critical of private governance, and which is seen as part of a more neoliberal ideology, and it also reflects a sort of call to bring the state back in. That was reflected in the sort of initial law proposals that were presented by civil society organizations. And then we identify a market-based discourse that is more the sort of business discourse and understanding of due diligence. And this relies on the idea of self-organizing markets, and that corporate social responsibility and private voluntary measures are basically sufficient. They just need to be improved. So they argue basically that certification, codes of conduct is sufficient. There is just like a few laggards that do not adapt these private voluntary standards in a good way. So this is basically a discourse that emphasizes that there is no need for a law, or there is a need for a law that is very watered down or weak. And then sort of in between is a polycentric discourse that is somehow in between in a way, because it relies on the assumption that effective solution to complex problems such as governing complex global supply chain requires a smart mix of both mandatory and voluntary measures. And it also requires that different actors collaborate so that they could sort of compensate for each other's weaknesses. Yeah, so these were sort of overarching like discourses that we found in these cases. We could change the slide. So at the EU level, I will just briefly introduce which, as this is the case that we will work more closely with in the Rebalance project. And I think you all know this case as well. In 2020, the EU Commission published a study on due diligence that was written by Lisa Smith and colleagues. And in the same year, they also published a study on directors' duties and the sustainable corporate governance. But it took quite some time, not until last year in March, until the Commission presented its proposal. And it's often emphasized that this is due to the business lobbying. And there have also been 2 rounds of public consultation, which we plan to look more closely into the input statements of business associations and individual companies. And some of the, just broadly, like some of the issues that has been more contested are director duties and the corporate governance issues. And these aspects have been increasingly removed from the existing proposal. But also the question of SMEs, civil liability, and how a established business relationship should be defined. But it's interesting because when we started to look at this, when we did the analysis of the policymaking process in France and Germany, my impression was that there was a sort of quite clear opposition of the companies. They emphasized that they were basically clearly against regulation. And in the case of France, it was a little bit more conciliatory, and some of the companies had this more in-between discourse of polycentric smart mix narrative, which there was some sort of acceptance of regulatory rules. But when you look at the EU statements, it seems like they're at least like they say that they support, more than half of the companies express that they support regulation at the EU level. But the question is, of course, what this actually means if they express that they support it, but actually will try to weaken it, because this kind of expression that they support it many times comes with statements that they support it, but they support a sort of weaker version than the existing ones. So, but at the same time, it seems like there are some differences between companies in different countries and different sectors, and we would like to further understand what these variance across companies in different countries and sector, what it actually means, and if companies under some circumstances actually accept or promote the strengthening of regulatory controls at the EU level. Okay, so we go to the next slide. So to go back a little bit to the analysis of France, which I've been looking more closely into, it's interesting to understand how companies interpret their due diligence regulations. As the French duty vigilance law has been in place for some years now. It was adopted in 2017. So together with my colleagues, I have been analyzing corporate documents from 2017 until today and interviewed company representatives. So this is a relatively small sample of only 4 companies that we studied in depth. So I would just like to share some reflections, some findings based on that analysis of the vigilance plan of these companies in the agri-food companies. So first, it's clear that companies have made some changes in their sustainability management as a consequence of the law. Over the years, it seems like they have improved their risk assessment. It becomes more sophisticated and in some aspects more transparent. At least they show the plans are longer. In the first year, the plans were only like 3 or 4 pages. In the last year, the plans could be up to 50 pages. So it's significantly more details about how they go ahead to assess those risks. There are some initiatives to enhance traceability, but not in the whole supply chain. Most of the initiatives are focused on the first tier, and also some improvement when it comes to the grievance mechanisms. They have included environment, and they have extended them to not only be for the employees, but also to external stakeholders, to the companies and right holders. And some companies report that they have started to make in-house analysis of NGO reports, so building some sort of internal capacities and not only relying on external experts for carrying out these risk assessments. However, it's very clear how they have prioritized different risk. Prioritization is an important aspect of due diligence because companies should be able to prioritize, but it should also be sort of transparent why they choose to focus on certain risk in certain countries, because and of course, like, it's important for stakeholders that they address the risks that are more important for them. But this is very unclear how they went about when they prioritize the risk. In many cases, they just say, in basically all of the cases, they just say, okay, so we decided to focus on deforestation in Brazil, for instance. Even though we know that there are a lot of other problems in the Brazilian Amazon, such as the land conflicts or modern slavery and these kind of problems. But it's very unclear how they went about when prioritizing certain risk over others. Second, in many cases, or in these cases that we analyzed, companies have relied on existing voluntary approaches, such as certifications, auditing, self-assessments. So they encourage their suppliers to send out self-assessment to analyze the risks that exist in their supply chains. And also, companies often refer to different types of multi-stakeholder initiatives. And it's quite unclear to what extent these measures have any actual impacts. They say, okay, we participated in 10 multi-stakeholder initiatives, but you don't really know to what extent that these activities will actually have any impact to really address the problems on the ground. Third, the legal liability and associated social activism seems to have some effect, that companies seem to take complaints more seriously. But also in some of the cases, it seems like this risk of legal liability has meant that due diligence has been moved from the Human Rights Department to the legal units, for instance, which was seen as quite problematic from the person that worked with this topic in these two companies, because that means that the company tried to protect itself to not end up in a lawsuit rather than protecting human rights. And it's also a risk, like there's a large literature that look into what this actually means. Is there a risk that you just focus on this sort of liability regime, that you focus on selected cases instead of deep sustainability transformation, which means basically that you clean up the supply chains to Europe from particularly problematic cases, but the sort of more deeper challenges, how to establish environmental justice and deep transformations, remain now. So how effective is this in the end? It raises these kind of questions now. And finally, with regards to transparency, it's a little bit contradictory in a way, because this sort of laws are supposed to improve transparency, and companies should share information on how they assess and address risk with society. But much of the data is confidential, and generally it's very hard to verify the claims of the company, because even though the due diligence vigilance plans are become longer and longer, it becomes just harder and harder to read and understand them, and to assess to what extent they source products from risk areas. And some companies even openly told us in the interviews that they have become less transparent due to the risk of lawsuits. So they've been sort of share information on basically what they do good, but that was basically what they told us. They share information on what they do good, but the things that they do not do so good, they try to more hide it. So there's a kind of contradictory impact of becoming less transparent in a way. Okay, the next slide. So I'm wrapping up here. I would just like to, I see that time is running, but I would just like to share this quote because I thought it was quite interesting and it's sort of open with a person who worked in one of these companies who somehow were struggling with making sense of how to implement due diligence. And I think that this relates to the question that we observe, like a lot of activities and a lot of interesting dynamism within the companies that aim to establish and improve their due diligence systems, but really don't know about the real influence of the adopted measures on the ground. There's a lot of indicators and data provided by the company. Typically, companies provide for insights about percentages or number of subsidiaries or suppliers who have participated in diverse initiatives, but they don't talk about the outcome of such activities. And one of the interviewees, she said like this: when your supply chain is so long, you feel like you run, and you try your hardest, but you actually don't know if it's going to make that person's life better. We put processes and tools in place, but you don't know. You don't see their consequences physically. Sometimes it's hard to kind of visualize that also for our colleagues. They want to see what you do and whether it makes a difference. But when something is so remote, that's really difficult. So I think that's kind of interesting that they are so open with these kind of challenges that they see. Okay, next slide. Yeah. Okay, so just to wrap up this case, I think that we can see that business lobbying has contributed to water down the law proposal, the initial law proposals developed by civil society organizations in countries such as France, Germany, and Switzerland, but also at the EU level. Yeah, to what extent, as I mentioned several times, like the key question, I guess, is to what extent these laws will actually have an impact. It's quite unclear yet to me. It depends on their institutional designs, but also how companies interpret their obligations in the implementation stage. And it's likely to also depend very much on how advocacy groups and state institutions pressure companies to comply or improve their behavior. So it's important to critically look into these issues, whether they actually have some impact on the ground. And I think that companies have also quite a lot of discretion when it comes to complying with their human rights and environmental due diligence obligations. The disclosure is quite selective, and as Nadia Bernaz and her colleague talked about, there is a sort of symbolic compliance, which we can also observe in this case of the French duty of vigilance law. Yeah, so I think it's important to think about how you can sort of tip the power balance here. And the final question, I guess, that we're also interested in looking into to what extent human rights and environmental due diligence contribute to institutionalize and legitimize existing private regulatory instruments. Yeah. Okay, thank you very much. And I'm sorry if I took a little bit too much time, Tim.
Not at all. Thank you so much, Maria-Therese. And as you can all tell, Maria-Therese has been doing some really fascinating and important work on the ways in which these laws get translated into corporate practices. So really great to see that. What I'm going to do is give a brief overview of our second policy domain. And before I do that, let me mention something I forgot, which Maria-Therese reminded me of, which is to mention our third collaborator, John Murray, who's not with us today, but who's working on this project actively. He is connected to SCORE, the Stockholm Center for Organizational Research, as well as the Stockholm Business School. And Maria-Therese is well versed in the area of human rights and environmental due diligence, and John and I are getting up to speed on carbon markets because this adaptation of national governance and regional governance to a world of global supply chains is happening not just around human rights and sort of environmental degradation in global supply chains, but around the way in which greenhouse gases and greenhouse gas emissions are regulated. So when the EU's emissions trading system was first created, it applied, not surprisingly, only to emissions occurring within the EU. But in a world of global supply chains, that of course excludes a large amount of greenhouse gas emissions, which are emitted outside the EU, but emitted for consumers within the EU. That is, products that are produced elsewhere but sold within the EU have greenhouse gas emissions that are not covered by the EU emissions trading system. So on one hand, this is a problem that the EU and environmental groups within the EU have been pushing for a solution to for quite some time, dating back nearly to the beginning of the EU emissions trading system. In addition, when the EU emissions trading system was set up, there was essentially a loophole created, an exception created for companies that faced a great deal of international competition, that is carbon intensive producers within the EU that could potentially be greatly disadvantaged by increased prices in international competition by the need to pay for carbon emissions within the EU. So companies in the steel, aluminum, cement industry, for instance, were given free allowances where they didn't actually have to pay for their carbon emissions in order to essentially protect them from international competition from competitors elsewhere in the world where there was no price on carbon. The EU's new carbon border adjustment mechanism changes all that. It ends this free allowance loophole and replaces it with a set of charges on imports into the EU, such that importers of carbon intensive products, cement, iron and steel, aluminum, fertilizer, electricity, and hydrogen, must pay essentially the equivalent to the EU carbon market price for the emissions that are generated, at least directly, in the production of those imported items. And this, unlike the due diligence case, is actually settled, essentially about to become a settled EU law that will initially begin its implementation this October, although just in a kind of monitoring phase, and the real changes will kick in over the next 5 to 10 years. So this carbon border adjustment mechanism faces a range of challenges, and I wanted to highlight a few of these. One, which is likely to become relevant very soon, is that it may be challenged under the rules of the World Trade Organization for illegitimately discriminating against products produced outside the EU. And indeed, you can see from this figure that we borrowed from a recent article that the effects will be felt largely outside the EU. In countries like India and China, for instance, that produce large amounts of steel for export to the EU and do not have an equivalent carbon price within those jurisdictions, but also by countries like Mozambique that produce by volume much less, but as a proportion of total exports, much more aluminum for export to the EU. So the Indian government is probably most likely to mount this challenge to the EU's carbon border adjustment mechanism within the WTO, but the potential joiners of that case are many, as you can see on this graph. Now, I should say, our understanding is that EU officials worked quite hard to make sure that this regulation was, in fact, WTO compliant, that it would not unfairly discriminate, and that it was consistent with principles in the Paris climate agreement. But I think the test of that remains to be seen in coming years. So this will be contested, I think, largely in international arenas, even if it's largely settled for the time being within the EU. A practical challenge, which relates to this legitimacy challenge, is how the EU will deal with carbon pricing or equivalent measures that are in place in other jurisdictions. So the idea is that companies should be paying for imports of carbon-intensive products where the emissions have not been covered by carbon markets elsewhere, and those emissions are essentially unregulated. But the EU will need to recognize systems that do regulate carbon emissions elsewhere and essentially discount the prices that EU importers are required to pay accordingly. This is relatively easy if there's a carbon market in place and a carbon price in place, but harder if there are carbon regulatory or greenhouse gas emission regulations that may have similar effects without pricing carbon emissions. Very quickly, since the CBAM has been settled, it's been challenged by a new wave of so-called green industrial policy in the US in the form of the Inflation Reduction Act, which takes a quite different approach to supporting a low carbon future based on supporting and channeling and guiding investment into low carbon industries through all sorts of supports and subsidies, which quite in some ways threatens the EU's approach. So there are, I think, big issues about how the EU will deal with a range of different approaches to climate policy and an increasing variety of approaches to climate policy in different parts of the world. There's also a big question as to what will happen as the free allowances that carbon-intensive producers within the EU have been getting are phased out. One of the political fights about the CBAM was about to what extent and how quickly these free allowances will be phased out. Some companies argued that the free allowances should persist, even as their competitors are forced to pay prices for imported emissions. That didn't hold, but as you see, there's a quite gradual process for phasing out these free allowances and phasing in the carbon border adjustments. In the initial years, these will be relatively small adjustments, but by the time we get to 2030 and beyond, we will have a much lower rate of free allowances and a much higher rate of carbon border adjustments actually being paid. A few things could happen, we think, at this point or over this period. One is that there could be rising corporate resistance in sectors where it's proven difficult to adjust to the decline of free allowances. That is, even companies that provisionally supported the formation of this carbon border adjustment mechanism to basically impose costs on their international competitors may rethink those preferences if they have trouble adjusting to the phase out of free allowances. There could also be a problem of kind of resource shuffling, where carbon accounting procedures are used to evade, in essence, the carbon border adjustments that are intended to be paid. We don't have any particular insight into how serious this problem will be, but there's no doubt that there will be attempts to make it seem like the carbon emissions of imported products are lower than they may actually be, based on alternative ways of thinking about direct and indirect emissions. All right, so in just a couple of minutes, I want to sum up what we've done today and just tell you a bit about where this is all heading. So the main thing that we want to communicate today is that we think we're in a political moment within the EU, but more broadly, in which government regulation is finally catching up with the world of supply chain capitalism that's been forged over the past 3 decades. And I think there's little doubt that that's occurring, that there is a resurgent wave of regulation that attends to carbon emissions, human rights, and environmental degradation in global supply chains. But as hopefully you've gotten a sense of from our sketches of these cases, there are some really big questions about what that re-regulation really means and what it will generate. So one question is whether this is really a kind of path-breaking change that suggests a break from a period of neoliberalism in which it was assumed that markets and companies could take care of many of these problems themselves, to a period of re-regulation in which states take a much more active role. It may in fact be that we're witnessing a path-breaking change toward more state-centered governance of global supply chains. But it may also be that we're seeing a kind of stretching or elaboration of a path in which private governance is still given quite a privileged role. As you saw in Maria-Therese's comments, or as you heard in Maria-Therese's comments, there's some ways in which the due diligence regulation and similar laws in Germany and France may in fact strengthen the role of private governance of certification, auditing, and reporting systems rather than replacing them or really altering them. Similarly, in the climate case, one of the things that the CBAM will do is increase the market for verified carbon emissions, which will allow importers to potentially reduce the rate of payments that they're responsible for. So this may actually be a growth and a stretching of the path toward private action and private regulation rather than a return to government regulation. Second, there are big questions about how the coalitions that have emerged to support, at least provisionally, this expansion of the EU's regulatory authority will weather the storm of implementation in both the climate case and in the human rights and environmental due diligence case. It's not hard to imagine that as implementation proceeds, some of these coalitions that emerge between business and civil society could quite strongly fracture over the meaning of due diligence and over the rules of carbon accounting that shape what kinds of emissions are actually compensated or not. Third, there's big questions that go well beyond this project about whether we're seeing a fundamental reconfiguration of global supply chains and maybe even an end to an era of supply chain capitalism in which regulatory changes contribute in some way to a kind of reshoring of supply chains or a greater regionalization rather than globalization of supply chains. The idea of these regulations is to spur improved governance outside the EU, but the regulations could in a variety of ways also shape the structure of sourcing and the geography of sourcing beyond the EU as well in various ways in our different domains. What we've done today is really try to introduce these cases, and we look forward to hearing your responses. I want to end with just a brief note on what we're doing as part of the Rebalance project to unpack some of the policy coalitions, the political coalitions behind these regulations. So our interest, as we mentioned earlier, is in large part in under what conditions companies will actually have a preference in expanding regulation and strengthening EU regulation as opposed to watering it down. And so we're doing two things to try to sort that out. One is we're coding the statements that companies contributed in the feedback period, in the consultation periods on these regulations to create a database to try to assess some patterns and some cleavages across industries, maybe at the across different types of firms within industries as well. And second, we're going to soon start doing interviews with companies and policymakers to try to understand a bit more about the evolution of preferences and strategies among firms in different parts of the EU and different sectors. It may be that companies in places like Germany and France, where there are already due diligence regulations on the books, we're happy to see the EU expand in this arena and impose those costs on their competitors, but it may also be that the conditions for that support were quite narrow. Similarly, it may be that companies in carbon-intensive industries saw an interest in promoting the CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, to increase the costs of their competitors from India, China, and the US, among other countries. But it may also be that they were worried about losing their free allowances and their ability to adjust to that change. And so we're going to try to understand in a bit more dynamic way the evolution of corporate preferences and strategies toward regulation in these two arenas. Thanks so much. We look forward to the discussion and to continuing this research.